You may remember the sound of a screen door closing. Not slamming, though it could slam if you were careless, but that particular sound it made when the spring pulled it shut behind you. Metal scraping against metal, then the soft bounce as it settled into place. That sound meant you were going somewhere. Outside, into the day, into whatever was waiting. The door had a weight to it. You had to push with your whole body sometimes, especially the smaller you were. The mesh screen had that crosshatch pattern, fine enough to keep the bugs out, but open enough that you could press your nose against it and see through to the street. The frame was usually white, or had been white once before years of hands pushing it left their marks. Sometimes there were tears in the screen, patched with newer screen that didn't quite match, or just left there because a small hole didn't matter that much. Going through that door meant leaving the inside world behind. Inside was cooler in summer, warmer in winter, but inside was also where your mother was, which meant you could be called back at any moment to do something you didn't want to do. Outside was different. Outside was freedom. At least until dinner time, or until the streetlights came on, or until you heard your name being called from a doorway down the block. The porch you stepped onto might have been concrete, painted gray or green, or it might have been wood, weathered and splintering in places. There might have been a metal glider, the kind with the cushions that never stayed tied on quite right, or a couple of chairs, or nothing at all. Some porches had flower pots your mother tended. Some had absolutely nothing but space and air and a view of the street. And the street was everything. You might remember how it looked early in the morning when the sun was still low and everything had that fresh quality to it. The concrete was still cool. The air hadn't started to thicken with heat yet. Maybe there was dew on the grass, making the lawns darker green than they'd be by afternoon. The trees, if you had them, made shadows that actually looked cool, not just dark. Your neighborhood had a rhythm to it. You knew this rhythm without thinking about it. You knew what time the milk truck came if you still had milk delivery. You knew when Mr. Peterson from 3 doors down would back his car out of the driveway heading to work. You knew when the paper boy would come by on his bicycle, the canvas bag heavy with newspapers slung across his body, riding with no hands sometimes, tossing the papers onto porches with that particular arc. Sometimes he hit the porch, sometimes he didn't. The houses on your street probably looked similar to each other. Not identical, but similar. Similar enough that you knew which one was yours by feel more than by sight. Small houses, most of them. 2 bedrooms, maybe 3 if you were lucky. 1 bathroom, a living room, a kitchen, a backyard. That was enough. That was what a house was. The colors were probably muted. Browns and tans and whites and greens. Nothing bright, nothing that stood out too much. Shutters on some windows. Screen windows in summer with storms put on in winter if your father was the type to do that. Chain-link fences separating yards, or hedges, or nothing at all because people didn't worry as much about exactly where their property ended and their neighbors began.
You knew every crack in the sidewalk. You knew which sections tilted up from tree roots pushing underneath. You knew where the good puddles formed when it rained, the ones deep enough to splash through. You knew where the hopscotch grid was chalked on the concrete, faded and redrawn over and over by different kids, each generation adding their own version on top of the ghosts of the ones before. The street itself was probably asphalt, soft in the summer heat. You could smell it when it got really hot, that tar smell mixing with the smell of cut grass and the faint exhaust smell from cars. The asphalt had cracks too, and weeds growing up through them that nobody bothered to pull. Some streets had gravel shoulders, some had nothing but the grass edge of people's lawns. There might have been a corner store within walking distance, maybe 2 or 3 blocks away, maybe 5, but you could get there on foot or on your bicycle, without crossing any streets your mother considered too dangerous. This was important because the corner store was where everything happened. The store probably had a name, Sam's or Joe's or Ed's Market, just the owner's name and the word market or store or grocery. The sign might have been hand-painted, fading but still readable. The building was small, one room really, packed with narrow aisles and shelves that went all the way to the ceiling, a wooden floor that creaked, a smell that was particular to that place and nowhere else, a combination of produce and dust and old wood, and the specific smell of the cold case where they kept the milk and the butter and the eggs. The man behind the counter knew you. He knew your parents. He probably knew your grandparents. He'd give you credit if your mother called ahead, or sometimes even if she didn't, and you'd carry the items home in a paper bag, and your mother would pay him the next time she was in. And nobody thought this was strange, because this was simply how things worked. The candy counter was low enough that you could see into it, glass protecting all those small treasures, each one costing just pennies. Mary Janes and Bit of Honeys and Tootsie Rolls, and those paper strips with the colored dots of sugar on them, wax bottles filled with colored liquid, pixie sticks, candy cigarettes in the boxes that looked like real cigarette boxes, though they were just pressed sugar, jawbreakers that would last all day if you didn't bite down, bazooka bubble gum with the little comic inside the wrapper that you'd read even though the joke was never funny. You'd hand over your nickel or your dime or your quarter, and he'd reach into the case with wax paper and pull out your selection, and you'd walk out of that store with your treasure already half-eaten, the sweetness of it mixing with the summer air.
Sometimes you'd sit on the curb outside the store, or on the bench if there was one, and eat your candy slowly, making it last, watching the street. Cars would go by, not many. Not the constant stream you'd see later in life, but enough. The cars themselves were different, bigger, wider, made of actual metal that would dent and rust. Colors that weren't just silver and white and black, but turquoise and cream and two-tone combinations that seemed normal then. The sound they made was different too, deeper, heavier. You could hear them coming from blocks away. Your own family car, whatever it was probably parked in the driveway or on the street in front of your house. Your father washed it on Saturday mornings sometimes, with a bucket and a sponge and the hose, in his undershirt, taking his time. The car wasn't just transportation, it was something to care for, something that mattered. It had cloth seats that were hot in the summer and cold in the winter. It had ashtrays in the back doors. It had windows you rolled down by hand, cranking the handle, and no one thought this was inconvenient. It had a radio that your father controlled, and you didn't question this. Riding in that car, you weren't in a car seat. You weren't even wearing a seatbelt, because most cars didn't have them, or if they did, nobody used them. You sat in the back seat, probably fighting with your brother or your sister about who had to sit in the middle. The middle seat was the worst because it had the hump from the transmission and less space and nothing to look at but the back of your parents' heads. The window seats were better. You could lean against the door, feel the vibration of the road, watch the world go by. Long car trips were different then. They took forever because the highways were smaller and the speed limits were lower, and your father didn't like to stop unless he absolutely had to. Your mother might have packed sandwiches in a small cooler. There were no DVDs, no tablets, no screens of any kind. You had the window, or maybe a book, or maybe your sister's elbow in your ribs, and that was what you had. You counted cars, you played the license plate game, you asked, "Are we there yet?" until your father's jaw got tight and your mother turned around and gave you that look. Vacation might have meant a cabin by a lake, or visiting relatives in another state, or camping if your family was the camping type. It meant motels with swimming pools that smelled like chlorine, and rooms with 2 double beds and thin walls and television sets that got 3 channels if you were lucky. It meant diners with sticky menus and bottomless coffee for your parents and breakfast all day. It meant postcards you were supposed to send to your grandparents, but probably forgot about until you were already home. But most of the time, you weren't on vacation. Most of the time, you were just home.
And home had its own rhythms and rituals and ways of being that felt permanent, like they'd never change, like they'd always be exactly this way. Mornings started early, at least for your father. You might have heard him moving around, getting ready for work while you were still half asleep. The sound of water running, the sound of the coffee percolator starting its cycle, that bubbling sound as it worked. The smell of coffee filling the house, mixing with the smell of toast. Maybe the sound of a radio, low, bringing the news and the weather and the traffic report, though there wasn't much traffic to report on.
Your mother might have made him breakfast, eggs and toast and bacon. The bacon smelled strong enough to wake you up if the coffee smell hadn't already. Or maybe she just had coffee ready and he grabbed something on his own. Every family was different. But the morning had a shape to it, a pattern that repeated day after day until it was just the way mornings were. He'd leave for work in a suit or in work clothes, depending on what he did. He carried a metal lunchbox, maybe, the kind with a thermos that screwed into the lid, or he carried a briefcase. He backed the car out of the driveway carefully because you or your siblings might be anywhere, and then he was gone for the day. And the house shifted into its daytime mode, which was quieter, slower, more the domain of your mother and whatever she had to do. If you were young enough, you stayed home with her. If you were school age, you got ready for school, which meant getting dressed in clothes that had been laid out the night before, or that you grabbed from your drawer or your closet without thinking too hard about it. Nobody matched, nobody coordinated. You wore what you wore. You ate breakfast. Cereal from a box, or toast, or oatmeal if your mother made it, though you probably didn't want oatmeal. You gathered your things, your school books, your lunchbox. The lunchbox was metal. It had a picture on it, probably, a TV show or a cartoon or just a scene of some kind. It had a thermos inside, also with a picture, and the thermos cap was also a cup, which was clever but never worked quite right because the cup was too small to be useful. Your mother packed your lunch in the morning or the night before. A sandwich wrapped in wax paper, an apple or a banana, cookies in a small bag, maybe a small bag of chips. The thermos held milk or juice or Kool-Aid, and by lunchtime it was never quite as cold as it should be. Walking to school, you probably weren't alone. You met up with other kids from your street. You walked together, a small group. The older ones looking after the younger ones, or supposed to be looking after them, though mostly everyone just walked and talked and dawdled and took their time because what was the rush? The school building was brick. It had been there longer than you'd been alive. It would be there long after you left. The hallways were wide and smelled like floor wax and old books and cafeteria food and chalk. The floors were either tile or wood, and they echoed when you walked, so you could always hear everyone coming and going. The lockers were metal and had combination locks that sometimes jammed. The water fountains were porcelain, the kind where you had to press down on a lever and the water came out in an arc that you had to lean into to drink from. Your classroom had big windows that actually opened. The teacher would open them on nice days or when the room got too stuffy. There was no air conditioning. There were no computers. There was a chalkboard at the front of the room, a big wooden desk for the teacher, and rows of smaller desks for the students. Your desk probably had a top that lifted up so you could store things inside. It probably had marks carved into it from the students who had sat there before you. It probably had wads of gum stuck underneath that you tried not to touch. The teacher stood at the front of the room and taught. She wrote on the chalkboard with chalk that made a particular sound and left dust on her hands that she'd wipe off on a cloth. She had a ruler that she might have slapped on the desk to get everyone's attention, or that she might have used on your knuckles if you misbehaved, though that depended on when this was and where you went to school and what was considered acceptable. You learned reading and writing and arithmetic. You learned by copying things from the board, by doing worksheets, by listening to the teacher talk. You learned the same way generations before you had learned, in the same building, sometimes from the same teachers, using the same methods. And it worked, mostly, or at least well enough that you learned what you needed to learn and moved on to the next grade. Lunchtime meant the cafeteria, or if you were young enough, walking home for lunch and walking back afterward. The cafeteria was loud and smelled like whatever they were serving that day. The food came on trays divided into sections. There was always a main dish, always a vegetable, always a small carton of milk. The milk was cold, sweating on the outside, and it came in different flavors if you were lucky, white milk or chocolate milk or sometimes strawberry milk. You'd trade things with your friends. You'd complain about what you got. You'd eat what you could stomach and throw away the rest. Recess meant going outside if the weather was good, or to the gym if it wasn't. Outside there was a playground with equipment that was made of metal and wood and that got hot in the sun and cold in the winter, and that was probably dangerous by later standards, but that you played on anyway. There were swings and slides and monkey bars and merry-go-rounds that you could spin fast enough to make yourself sick. There were tetherball poles and basketball hoops and areas for kickball or dodgeball or whatever game got organized that day. You played hard. You ran and jumped and climbed and fell and got back up. You got dirty. You scraped your knees. You tore your clothes sometimes. You got in fights or arguments or your feelings got hurt. And then you got over it and played again. The teachers watched, sort of, but they didn't hover. They didn't organize every activity or intervene in every dispute. You worked things out yourselves, or you didn't, and either way, you learned something. The bell rang to call you back inside. You lined up, more or less, and filed back into the building, back to your classroom, back to your desk. The afternoon stretched out. More lessons, more sitting still, more watching the clock on the wall, willing it to move faster, willing the day to end. And eventually it did end. The final bell rang. You gathered your things. You walked home, the same route in reverse, with the same group of kids, taking your time again because there was no reason to hurry. Home would be there. Your mother would be there. The afternoon would unfold the way it always did. At home, you'd drop your school bag somewhere your mother would tell you not to leave it. You'd change out of your school clothes if your mother made you, or you'd just go outside in what you were wearing if she didn't care. Outside was where you wanted to be. Outside was where everything happened. The neighborhood in the afternoon was a different place than it was in the morning. The fathers were still at work. The mothers were inside doing whatever mothers did, laundry and dishes and cooking and cleaning and 1,000 other things that made the house run. But the kids were outside, and the outside belonged to the kids. You might have had a bicycle. Probably you had a bicycle. It wasn't a fancy bicycle. It wasn't a mountain bike or a racing bike or a BMX bike designed for tricks. It was just a bicycle. It had fat tires and maybe a banana seat and maybe high handlebars and maybe a basket or maybe not. It might have had a bell. It definitely had pedals and wheels and handlebars, and that was enough. You rode that bicycle everywhere, down your street, around the block, across the neighborhood, to the park, to the store, to your friend's house. You rode it standing up, pumping the pedals hard. You rode it sitting down, coasting. You rode it with no hands if you were good at that. You put baseball cards in the spokes with clip-spins so they made that flapping sound as the wheels turned, which didn't serve any purpose except that it sounded good and made your bike feel faster. You built ramps out of plywood and cinder blocks and jumped off them. You raced each other down hills. You rode through puddles. You crashed, sometimes, and scraped your knees or your elbows or just got bruised, and you got back on and kept riding because that's what you did. Your parents didn't know where you were exactly. They didn't have cell phones to call you or GPS to track you. You just had to be home by dinner, or by the time the streetlights came on, whichever came first. And you were, usually, or close enough to it that it didn't matter. You knew how long it took to get home. You knew how much time you had. You kept track in your head without really thinking about it. The freedom of those afternoons is hard to explain to someone who didn't live it.
You could go anywhere you could reach on your bicycle or on foot. You could explore empty lots and creeks and woods and construction sites and places you probably weren't supposed to be but went anyway. You could build forts out of scrap wood. You could catch tadpoles in jars. You could climb trees. You could dig holes for no reason. You could do nothing at all, just lie in the grass and watch the clouds and feel time pass without counting it. There were no scheduled activities for most of you. No soccer practice or piano lessons or tutoring or enrichment programs. You had school, and you had church on Sunday if your family went to church, and you had chores you were supposed to do, and beyond that, your time was your own, and what you did with it was up to you. Sometimes you played with friends. Sometimes you played alone. Sometimes you made up games with rules that didn't make sense to anyone but you. Sometimes you just wandered. The point wasn't productivity. The point wasn't learning or improving or developing skills. The point was just being a kid and being outside and filling the hours until you had to go in. When you did go in, when you heard your name being called, or when the street lights came on, or when you just got hungry enough to go home on your own, you'd come through that screen door again, this time going the other direction. Inside to outside earlier, and now outside to inside. The house would smell like dinner cooking. Your mother would tell you to wash your hands. You'd sit at the table and eat with your family, all of you together, because that's when you ate dinner, together, at the table, as a family. The television might be on during dinner, or it might not. That depended on your family's rules. Some families didn't allow it. Some families always had it on. Some families only turned it on for certain shows. But the television was there, in the living room or the family room, a piece of furniture as important as the couch or the coffee table. The television itself was probably a large wooden cabinet with a small screen. The screen might have been 19 inches, maybe 21 if you had a newer set. It was black and white, or it was color, and if it was color, that was something special, something worth mentioning. The picture came from an antenna, either rabbit ears on top of the set or an antenna on the roof. You had to adjust the antenna to get a clear picture. Sometimes someone had to stand there and hold the antenna in just the right position while everyone else watched. Sometimes the picture came in clear, and sometimes it didn't, and you watched it anyway, through the static and the snow and the ghosting. You had maybe 3 channels, maybe 4 or 5 if you lived in a city or if your antenna was particularly good. ABC, NBC, CBS, and PBS if you could get it. That was what you had. That was what everyone had. And it was enough, because you didn't know there could be more.
The shows came on at specific times. You knew what time your show was on, and you made sure you were home for it or you missed it, because there was no recording it, no watching it later, no streaming it or finding it online. It aired once, at the time it aired, and if you missed it, you missed it. Saturday morning was for cartoons. You woke up early, earlier than you woke up for school, and you went to the living room in your pajamas and turned on the television and watched cartoons for hours. Bugs Bunny and Scooby-Doo and Super Friends and Schoolhouse Rock during the commercial breaks. You ate cereal out of the box, or you made yourself a bowl with milk and sat on the floor close to the television because your mother was still asleep and wasn't there to tell you to sit back. Sunday night might have been for a family show, something everyone watched together. The Wonderful World of Disney, or 60 Minutes, or whatever show your family had adopted as the one you watched together. You sat in your spots, your father in his chair, your mother on the couch, the kids on the floor, or squeezed onto the couch. You watched, and during commercials you talked, or you got up to get a snack, or you just waited for the show to come back on. The commercials were part of the experience. You knew the jingles. You could sing along with them. You wanted the toys they advertised, or the cereals, or the games, and you asked for them, and sometimes you got them for your birthday or Christmas, and sometimes you didn't. The commercials were loud and bright and repetitive, and they worked on you in ways you didn't understand, but that didn't matter because you were just a kid, and you wanted what you wanted.
When the show ended, you went to bed. School night or not, there was a time when the television went off and the day ended. Your parents might watch a little longer, Johnny Carson or the news, but you were in bed, in your room, in the dark, or with a small nightlight, and you went to sleep without screens or devices or anything but your own thoughts and the sounds of the house settling around you. Your room was small. You might have shared it with a brother or a sister. You had a bed and a dresser and maybe a small closet. You had toys, but not as many as kids would have later. You had a few special things, a teddy bear, a favorite car, a doll, whatever mattered to you. You had posters on the wall maybe, or drawings you'd done, or nothing at all. It didn't need to be much. It was just where you slept. The sounds of the house at night were familiar. The refrigerator humming, the house creaking as the temperature changed, your parents talking in the other room, their voices low and indistinct, a car going by outside, a dog barking somewhere. These sounds were the background of your sleep, so constant you didn't really hear them, but if they'd stopped, you would have noticed. And then it was morning again, and the whole cycle started over. Weekends were different, but they had their own patterns. Saturday was chores in the morning, mowing the lawn if you were old enough, or helping your father if you weren't, raking leaves in the fall, shoveling snow in the winter, helping your mother with cleaning or laundry or whatever needed doing. You complained, probably, but you did it because that's what kids did. You helped.
Saturday afternoon was your own. You played, or you went to a friend's house, or you rode your bike, or you did whatever you wanted to do until dinner. Saturday night might have been special. Maybe your family went out. Maybe you got McDonald's or went to a drive-in movie or just stayed home and watched television. It didn't matter much what you did. What mattered was that it was Saturday and you didn't have school tomorrow. Sunday was church for many families. You got dressed up in clothes you didn't like, clothes that were itchy or tight or uncomfortable. You sat in a pew and tried to sit still while the service went on, which felt like it went on forever. You listened, or you pretended to listen, or you counted ceiling tiles, or studied the stained glass windows, or read the hymnal even though you couldn't really read yet. You sang when you were supposed to sing, you stood when you were supposed to stand, you sat when you were supposed to sit. After church was Sunday dinner, which was the biggest meal of the week. A roast or a ham or fried chicken, mashed potatoes, vegetables, rolls, a dessert, usually pie. The table was set with the good dishes. Everyone sat together, everyone ate slowly. There was conversation or there was silence, but either way there was togetherness. This meal mattered in a way that regular dinners didn't. This was the meal that held the week together. Sunday afternoon was quiet. Your father might nap in his chair, your mother might read or work on something. You played, but quietly, because Sunday was a day of rest, and you were supposed to rest, even if you didn't understand why you needed rest when you'd been resting all weekend. And then it was Monday again, and the week started over, and you were back to school and homework and the regular rhythm of regular days. The seasons changed, and with them the textures of daily life shifted, but the patterns remained the same. Summer was freedom. Summer was heat and long days and no school, and time that seemed to expand infinitely. You woke up without an alarm. You stayed outside until it was too dark to see. You went barefoot and got dirty and drank from the garden hose because it was there and you were thirsty and no one thought twice about it. Summer nights were different from winter nights. The windows were open. You could hear everything. Crickets and cicadas making their noise, someone's radio playing, people talking on their porches, a car going by, thunder in the distance if a storm was coming. The air was thick and warm, and even with a fan going, it wasn't exactly comfortable, but it was summer, and this was how summer felt. Fall meant school starting again, which was terrible and inevitable, but fall also meant cooler air and leaves changing and the smell of leaves burning in piles at the curb. People burned leaves then.
They raked 'em into piles and set 'em on fire, and nobody called the fire department or worried about air quality. The smoke had a smell that was completely distinct, and if you smell it now, even for a second, you're immediately back there, watching the smoke curl up into the gray afternoon sky. Fall meant Halloween, which meant costumes you made at home or bought cheap at the dime store. You were a ghost with a sheet with holes cut out for eyes. You were a hobo with old clothes and a stick with a bandana tied to it. You were a princess or a cowboy or a monster with a plastic mask that didn't fit right and that made it hard to breathe. You went trick-or-treating in your neighborhood, in the dark, without your parents walking with you if you were old enough to go alone. You carried a pillowcase or a paper bag, and you went door to door, and people gave you candy, full-size candy bars sometimes, and you said thank you and moved on to the next house. You came home with a bag full of candy, and you dumped it on the floor and sorted it. The good stuff, the chocolate bars and the suckers, went in one pile. The less good stuff, the candy corn and the Smarties, went in another. The weird stuff that no one wanted, the bit of honeys and the ancient hard candies, went in a third pile that you'd eventually throw away or give to someone you didn't like. Winter meant cold and snow if you lived in a place with snow. It meant wearing layers and hats and gloves that you always lost. It meant boots with buckles that were hard to fasten. It meant coming inside with your fingers numb and your cheeks red and your mother making you hot chocolate, the kind from a packet that you mixed with hot water or milk. Not the fancy kind, just the simple kind that tasted like sugar and warmth. Winter meant Christmas, which started after Thanksgiving and built slowly. The decorations came out of the basement or the attic, boxes of ornaments and lights that might or might not work until you plugged them in and tested each bulb. The tree went up, a real tree that your father brought home tied to the top of the car, a tree that smelled like pine and dropped needles on the floor no matter how much water you gave it. You decorated the tree as a family. The lights went on first, the big colored bulbs, not the tiny white ones, and they got hot to the touch if you left them on too long. The ornaments were a mix of old and new, some of them fragile, some of them handmade, each one with its own history that your mother would tell you if you asked. The tinsel came last, draped strand by strand if your mother was particular, or thrown in clumps if she didn't care that much. The presents appeared gradually under the tree as Christmas got closer. You shook them when your parents weren't looking. You tried to guess what was inside by the shape and the weight and the sound. You counted how many had your name on them. You counted down the days until Christmas morning with an impatience that was almost painful. Christmas morning came early. You woke up when it was still dark, and you woke your parents, and you all went to the living room together. The tree lights were on, and the room was warm, and the presents were there, waiting. You opened them one at a time, or all at once in a frenzy of torn paper and ribbon, depending on your family's tradition. You got toys and clothes and books, and maybe something you really wanted, or maybe something you'd never asked for but pretended to like anyway. The day unfolded slowly after that. Breakfast, then relatives arriving, if that was part of your tradition, aunts and uncles and cousins and grandparents filling the house with noise and food and chaos. Dinner in the early afternoon, turkey or ham, all the same foods as Thanksgiving, but somehow different because it was Christmas. Desserts, too. Too many desserts, pies and cookies and candies, everyone eating until they were too full and then eating more anyway. By evening, you were exhausted and overwhelmed and probably fighting with your siblings over a toy or just because it was the end of a long day. But it was Christmas, and tomorrow it would be over and everything would go back to normal. But for today, it was still Christmas, and that made everything somehow okay. Spring meant mud and rain and things starting to grow again. It meant your mother planting flowers or a garden. It meant you helping, or supposed to be helping, digging holes or pulling weeds or just staying out of the way.
It meant the world turning green again, slowly, and then all at once, until the trees had leaves and the grass needed mowing, and everything felt alive in a way it hadn't felt during the gray months of winter.
Spring meant Easter, which meant a new dress or a new suit if your family was the type to dress up. It meant church and Easter egg hunts and baskets with fake grass and chocolate bunnies that you bit the ears off first. It meant spring break if your school had spring break, which might mean a trip or might just mean a week at home doing nothing special but enjoying the time off anyway. And then summer would come around again and the cycle would continue, year after year, each year the same but different, each year you a little older but the rhythms and the patterns remaining constant, holding everything together. You remember the barber shop, maybe, the one your father took you to, or the one you went to yourself when you got older. It smelled like talcum powder and hair tonic and that blue liquid the combs sat in. It had a red and white pole outside that turned endlessly. It had chairs, the waiting chairs with old magazines, and the barber chairs that were high and had footrests and pumps that raised you up or lowered you down. The barber knew your name. He knew how you liked your hair cut, or he knew how your father wanted your hair cut, which might not have been the same thing, but didn't matter because your father was paying. He'd drape the cape around you and snap it at the back and start cutting, the scissors making that snipping sound, the clippers buzzing when he got to the edges. Hair fell onto the cape and onto the floor. You tried to sit still, you watched yourself in the mirror and tried not to look too interested in watching yourself. When he was done, he'd brush the loose hair off your neck with a soft brush, and sometimes he'd splash something on that stung a little, and then he'd whip the cape off with a flourish, and you'd be done. Your father paid him in cash. They talked about the weather or sports or nothing in particular. You left with your hair shorter and your neck itchy and a strange feeling that you looked different but couldn't quite identify how. The diner was another place you might remember. The one in town or the one on the highway if you lived in a small enough place that the highway was where everything was. It had a counter with stools that swiveled and booths with vinyl seats that were cracked in places and tables with formica tops that were scrubbed clean but still showed their age. It had menus that were sticky and smelled faintly of old grease. It had waitresses who called you Hun and filled your coffee cup without asking and wrote your order on a little pad and tucked their pencil behind their ear. The food was simple. Eggs and bacon and hash browns for breakfast, burgers and fries for lunch, meatloaf or chicken fried steak for dinner, pie always, whatever kind they had that day. The portions were large, the prices were small. You ate until you were full, and then you paid at the register by the door, and you left a tip on the table, and that was that. The phone on the kitchen wall was another fixture of daily life. It had a rotary dial, or it had push buttons if it was newer, but either way it was attached to the wall with a cord that got tangled. The handset had a cord too, a curly cord that stretched only so far before it pulled back. If you wanted privacy while talking on the phone, you didn't have it. You talked in the kitchen where everyone could hear, or you stretched the cord as far as it would go into the next room and hoped no one was listening. You answered the phone without knowing who was calling. There was no caller ID, no screening. The phone rang and you picked it up and you said hello, and whoever was on the other end identified themselves or didn't. Sometimes it was someone calling for your parents, sometimes it was a wrong number, sometimes it was a friend calling to see if you could come out and play. You talked, or your parents talked, and when you were done, you hung up and the phone went back to being just a thing on the wall, silent until it rang again. Long-distance calls were expensive. You didn't make them casually. If you called someone far away, you kept it short. You watched the clock. You said what you needed to say, and then you said goodbye and you hung up, because every minute cost money, and there was no unlimited plan, no cheap calls, just the reality of distance and wires and the cost of connecting one place to another. The mailbox at the end of the driveway or on the porch brought the mail once a day, 6 days a week. The mailman came at roughly the same time every day, and you knew when to expect him, and sometimes you waited for him if you were expecting something. Bills came in the mail, letters came in the mail, postcards came in the mail,
Catalogs came in the mail. Big, thick catalogs from Sears or Montgomery Ward that you could spend hours looking through, circling the things you wanted, dreaming about the things you'd never get. You might remember the sound of the lawnmower on a Saturday morning. Not your father's lawnmower specifically, but all the lawnmowers in the neighborhood starting up around the same time. A symphony of small engines and cut grass. The smell of cut grass was everywhere, thick and green and alive, mixing with the smell of gas and oil from the mowers. Mowing the lawn was a chore, one you might have been responsible for if you were old enough. You pushed the mower back and forth in straight lines or in circles or in whatever pattern worked. The mower was heavy and loud, and you had to put your weight into it to keep it moving. When you were done, you were sweaty and tired and covered in grass clippings and bits of cut grass stuck to your legs. But the lawn looked neat, for a few days at least, until it grew back and needed mowing again. You might remember the library, the public library in your town, with its shelves of books and its particular smell of old paper and dust. You had a library card, a small piece of cardboard with your name typed on it, or written by hand, or printed by the librarian when you first got it. You carried this card with you when you went to the library, and you showed it when you checked out books, and the librarian stamped the due date on the card in the back of the book with a date stamp that made a satisfying thunk. You browsed the shelves, running your fingers along the spines, pulling out books that looked interesting, reading the first few pages to see if you liked them. You checked out a stack of books, as many as you were allowed, and you carried them home and you read them, and when they were due, you brought them back and got more. This was free entertainment. This was magic. This was a building full of stories, and you could take as many as you wanted. The playground at the park, if your town had a park, was made of metal and wood and concrete, and it was hot in the summer and cold in the winter, and it didn't care. The slide was metal and it burned your legs in the summer if you went down in shorts. The swings had chains that pinched your fingers if you weren't careful. The merry-go-round could be spun fast enough to throw you off if someone wanted to be mean. The monkey bars were high enough that falling would hurt. And you played on all of it anyway, and you fell sometimes, and you got hurt sometimes, and you learned to be more careful, or you didn't, and either way, you survived. There might have been a swimming pool, a public pool with a snack bar and a diving board, and lanes marked with floating ropes. You went there on hot summer days, and you waited in line to get in, and you paid a small fee, and you found a spot on the crowded concrete deck to put your towel. The pool was cold when you first got in, and crowded, and smelled like chlorine so strongly it stung your eyes. But it was water, and it was summer, and it was where everyone was. So you swam, and you played Marco Polo, and you practiced your cannonballs, and you stayed in until your fingers were pruned and your lips were blue, and your mother said it was time to go. The seasons cycled, the years passed, you got older. The world changed, though you didn't notice it changing because you were inside it, living it, not observing it from a distance. Things that seemed permanent started to shift. The corner store closed, or it changed owners, or it became something else. Families moved away. New families moved in. Your neighborhood wasn't quite the same neighborhood anymore, though the changes were so gradual you couldn't point to a moment when everything shifted.
But there was a feeling to those years, a texture to daily life that was distinct and real. Time moved differently. Days were longer, boredom was common, and boredom wasn't a problem to solve, it was just a state of being that you moved through until something interesting happened. You had time to think, time to wander, time to do nothing at all. There was no constant stimulation, no screens in your pocket, no notifications, no infinite scroll. You had the world immediately around you, and that was enough, because that was all there was. You talked to people face to face. You played games that required nothing but imagination. You read the same books over and over because you didn't have unlimited access to new ones. You watched the same TV shows because there were only a few channels and everyone watched the same things. And this created a kind of shared experience, a common culture that would become harder and harder to find as the years went on. You remember the feeling of summer rain, maybe, how the sky would darken in the afternoon and the air would get heavy and still, and then the rain would come, sudden and hard, drumming on the roof and running in streams down the gutters. You might have been outside when it started, and you might have run for cover, or you might have stayed out in it, letting it soak you, because you were already outside, and what did it matter if you got wet? The rain brought a smell, especially if it was the first rain after a dry spell. The smell of dust being washed away, of earth and water and growing things. The temperature would drop, the air would clear, and when the rain stopped, everything would be clean and fresh and new, and you'd go back outside, and the world would feel different, softer, quieter, the heat broken, at least for a little while. You remember the ice cream truck, maybe, the sound of it coming down your street, that tinny music playing from a speaker, the same song over and over, a song you can probably still hear in your head if you think about it. You'd be playing in your yard or on the street, and you'd hear that music, and you'd know what it was immediately, and you'd run inside to ask your mother for money, and she'd give you some change, or she'd say no, and if she said yes, you'd run back out to catch the truck before it passed your house. The truck was white, or it was painted with pictures of ice cream, and the man driving it would stop when you waved, and you'd run up to the window and look at the pictures of all the different options, and you'd pick one, and he'd reach into the freezer and pull it out and hand it to you, and you'd hand over your money, and you'd walk away with your prize already starting to melt in the heat. You ate it quickly, or tried to, but it always melted faster than you could eat it. It dripped down your hand, down your arm. It was sticky and sweet and cold and perfect. And when it was gone, you were left with a stick or a wrapper and hands that needed washing and a satisfaction that was complete and uncomplicated. These memories, all of them, are fragments, pieces of a life that was ordinary at the time, but that seems extraordinary now, in retrospect, because it's gone. Not completely gone. Some of these things still exist in some form, but gone in the sense that the world they belonged to, the context that made them what they were, has changed so much that even when the form remains, the essence is different. You can still find a corner store, maybe, but it's not the same as the corner store you knew. You can still find a diner, but it's not quite the same. You can still ride a bicycle and eat ice cream and watch the rain, but the feeling around these things, the texture of daily life, the pace and the priorities, and the way time felt, that's what's different. That's what's gone.
And maybe that's just how it works. Maybe every generation feels this way about the time they grew up in, the sense that something essential has been lost, that the world was better or simpler or more real when they were young. Maybe nostalgia is just the unavoidable ache of time passing and things changing, and the people we were becoming people we no longer are. But maybe it's more than that. Maybe there really was something different about growing up when you did, something about the pace of life, the space for boredom and imagination, the freedom to explore without constant supervision, the shared experiences that came from having only a few channels and a few stores and a few ways to spend your time. Maybe the world really was different in ways that mattered, in ways that shaped you, in ways that made childhood something distinct and valuable and worth remembering. You might think about this sometimes. You might find yourself telling stories to your children or grandchildren about how things used to be, and they might listen politely, or they might roll their eyes, because to them your past is ancient history, as distant and irrelevant as the Great Depression or World War II might have seemed to you when you were young. They can't imagine a world without the internet, without cell phones, without all the things that define their daily experience. and you can't quite explain to them what it felt like to live in a world without those things, because the absence of something is hard to describe. You can only talk about what was there, and even that is difficult, because the memories are fading, and the details are getting fuzzy, and you're not sure anymore what was real and what's just the story you've told yourself about what was real. But you know it was real. You know because you lived it. You know because you remember. You remember the screen door closing, the sound of it, the feel of it, the way it meant freedom and home at the same time. You remember summer afternoons that lasted forever. You remember the taste of candy that cost a penny. You remember the smell of cut grass and rain on hot pavement, and your mother's kitchen and the inside of your father's car. You remember the feeling of riding your bike with no destination, just riding for the sake of riding. You remember the blue glow of the television in a dark living room. You remember Christmas morning and Halloween night and Sunday dinners and Saturday cartoons. You remember being bored and being free and being young. You remember. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the act of remembering, of holding these fragments of the past in your mind, of turning them over like worn stones, smooth from handling, maybe that's what keeps them alive. Maybe that's what keeps that world alive, the world you grew up in, the world that exists now only in memory, but that was once as real and solid as the ground under your feet.
You remember, and in remembering, you're there again, for just a moment. For just as long as the memory lasts. You're standing on that porch, your hand on the screen door, and the whole world is waiting outside, and you're young, and summer is just beginning, and everything is possible. And then the memory fades, and you're back in the present, and the world has moved on, and you've moved on with it. But for that moment, you were there. You were home. And maybe you'll go back again the next time you remember. Maybe there's always a way back, as long as you can still hear the sound of that screen door closing, as long as you can still feel what it felt like to walk through it, out into the sunshine, into a day that seemed like it would never end. Those days did end, of course. Everything ends. But they happened. They were real, and they're still there, waiting, in the quiet spaces of memory, in the smell of something familiar, in a sound that catches you off guard, in a moment when everything stops and you're suddenly, unexpectedly, a child again, standing on the edge of an afternoon that stretches out forever. You remember, and that remembering matters. It matters because it was your life. It matters because it shaped you. It matters because it was real and true and ordinary and precious all at once. You remember the screen door. You remember summer. You remember home. And you always will.